Welcome everyone on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies and in this case the Argentine Working Group. We're very pleased to be having this seminar this afternoon with Wendy Hunter. This is a particularly timely topic she will be speaking about, from Getúlio to Lula, shifting orientations in Brazilian social policy. And she, I think, is a particularly impressive scholar to be speaking about it. She's a professor of government at the University of Texas at Austin. Her books include The Transformation of the Workers' Party in Brazil and Eroding Military Influence in Brazil, and she's published very widely about this and other themes in comparative politics, comparative political studies, and many other journals. She's also received her PhD in this very department here at Berkeley. It was 5 years ago?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
4 or 5 years ago.
Who's counting?
So she will speak first, and then we'll have time for questions and comments. Please join me in welcoming Wendy Hunter.
Thank you. Well, it is an exceptional thrill for me to speak in this room where 29 years ago, I arrived and introduced myself and met David Collier and Ruth. So some things don't change. The ROTC is still practicing out there, but I want to assure you the furniture has improved. It has. So thank you very much to the Center for Latin American Studies, to the Argentine Working Group, and to the Department of Political Science. So what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about some of my current research, which is actually on the Bolsa Familia. And I have a secondary line of research which is related, and that is about the provision of identity documents for poor Brazilians, which comes out of the Bolsa research. But I thought I would embed it in a larger story and framework about shifting orientations in social policy from the time of the Vargas period until Lula and beyond. And so the core argument here is that this reorientation in social policy towards capturing the informal sector, rural poor, really has contributed in a very significant way to incorporating previously excluded Brazilians. So citizenship, which includes social citizenship, has expanded remarkably since the mid-1990s for poor Brazilians. So the format of the talk is to discuss some of my specific research within the context of these broader changes. And I want to highlight aspects that have to do with my Bolsa research as well as my research on ID documents. So I put these two developments, along with changes in health, which have given universal preventative health care provisioning to poor Brazilians, into what I call changes in the citizenship regime. And I want to probe, after describing these broad changes, I want to probe the causes of these changes and assess the consequences for citizenship. I want to highlight some of the changes as well as some of the market continuities and explore the challenges ahead. So I would say right now, one of the big questions ultimately at stake with this research is, sort of stepping back, is whether we in fact are seeing a second moment of incorporation that is parallel to something like what Getúlio Vargas did in the Estado Novo, well, 30 to 45, as talked about in Shaping the Political Arena by the callers. This remains a question that I probe at the end of the talk. For now, though, I want to leave it as a question with having you think about the fact that we do see sort of an antecedent context in which the poor are incorporated in these new social programs. We see a post-adjustment set of changes, post-structural adjustment that opens up new space for thinking about social policy. We see lots of bureaucratic initiatives undertaken by technocrats who now believe there's simply a level below which countries do not let their people fall. And we've seen a quest for votes on the part of politicians in a fuller democracy that allows the Communist Party, that has illiterates voting. Remember, illiterates did not vote until 1988. So the twin developments of structural adjustment, move to the market, economic recovery, and democratization, together with a state that has much more bureaucratic oomph than it used to, I think has brought on much of this, and I'm going to ask at the end whether in fact it's an incorporation or not. So, as you know, the first moment was that of Getúlio Vargas, and the relevance of this is that the CLT, and here you see the emphasis on classe trabalhadora, was the unit by which you had occupational stratification and the incorporation of the formal sector. What we're looking at for the previous period, or for the current period, so if the CLT was the axis upon which the Vargas welfare state turned, I would say social assistance, non-contributory social programs that are exemplified but that include and exemplified by the Bolsa Familia and the non-contributory pension, the beneficio de prestação continuada. These are key aspects of the welfare state that have really come together and expanded under Lula and beyond. So these are very different programs, and here the word is familia. It's not your occupational status. This goes to individuals and families. So just to give you a couple visuals, the Bolsa Familia has time and time again in its advertisements this debit card, basically. This is important because it gives a direct payment to heads of family, usually mothers. This is what allows for the circumvention of political intermediaries, because one of my big points in sort of pushing the Bolsa as something new is that it is non-clientelist. If clientelism is defined as a quid pro quo between getting something and voting, that link is broken with the Bolsa because local politicians basically can't get their hands on this. So you have a new provisioning of a major social program that doesn't pass through the hands of subnational elites. So that's one of the really important parts of the Bolsa, which I think is one of the important bases of the new citizenship. It's not simply the money and the poverty reduction, it's how it comes through in the autonomy that gives people from these clientelist networks. So this is another part of it. Note, it doesn't say brought to you by the PT. The slogan is Un país de todos, a party, a country for all. That's the social inclusion. In many parts of the advertisements, it says, this is your right if you fall below a certain income level. This is not a favor. Do not feel like you have to vote for anyone to pick this up. So this is really the discourse of the Bolsa. This began on a local level, federalized under Cardozo. So I'm just briefly reviewing some of the cornerstones of the program. It expanded under Lula. Now 15 million families get it. So a quarter of the population is getting the Bolsa. It is conditional. Interestingly, you have to have your children attend school and get some basic health care. They do monitor this. They see if you are not doing this, they see it as a red flag. They will send social workers to your home, not so much with the spirit of cutting it off, but there must be something that really is drastically going wrong if you're not meeting these requirements. So it is conditional, but nonetheless, and it's means tested, Many people do not feel that it's stigmatizing. I'll talk about that later. And they do feel more social inclusion than stigmatization. How it works is at first, the first cut is a poverty map drawn up in very technocratic ways by the ministry in charge, the Ministry of Social Development, and then people apply on the local level for it. So you cannot circumvent the local level, the municipality altogether. But they go, and Brasilia ultimately makes the decisions with cross-checks on what you give for your income level and the like. Now, one thing the program does is it has bent over backwards in its design feature to find mechanisms to avoid political brokerage. So if you have a problem with your grant, there are numbers you can call in the ministry. There are social workers that are hired by the federal government, apart from the municipality, to try to help you walk through the program. So not only is this about anti-poverty and human development, getting kids in school, it's about trying to get Brazilians to think about a new way of doing social policy. Another program that is part of this new social policy provisioning in social assistance is the non-contributory pension. This is a very important program in keeping elders from falling below certain levels of extreme poverty. All you have to do to get this program is show your age and your poverty level. Okay, so it's completely non-contributory. It also goes to the disabled. You need to be really poor to get this program, under 1/4 of a minimum wage. Now, when I talk about democratization, okay, it's not like nothing happened between Vargas's and Lula's beginning. This actually is an outgrowth of the military regime. This is an outgrowth of the Fundo Rural focus that the military regime put into action in the 70s when they saw some rural mobilization starting up, and they also wanted to get votes for their government party. So there's a certain preemptive, preempting rural mobilization, but also how are we going to get votes for our politicians and stabilize this regime. So the roots of this go way back. I would say it really expanded more in the post-1990s, though. So shared features, to sum up. The new programs target in the informal sector. And the two programs that I've put your attention on are the Bolsa Familia and the BPC, but there's a whole host of universal public health programs that also fit this. These programs are addressing extreme poverty, but with the economic recovery, they are not tightly focalized like they used to be. There's broader coverage than there used to be. They are all means tested, though, and they go to individuals and families. So there's a certain neoliberal element to these in terms of the means testing, etc. However, even someone like Evelyn Huber, who has been against focalization or targeting, basically has said, means testing is compatible with basic universalism as long as the transfers are broadly targeted and presented as a citizenship right, not as charity or patronage. So even a Lula is has been a defender of the means testing aspect of this. Another very important new element that I think is one of the most important results of this current period is that the provisioning is designed in a way to avoid clientelism. There's a lot of ways in which these programs cannot be put into the hands of clientelist politicians for votes. And that really partly is relies on technology in order to put money directly into the hands of the beneficiaries. Another interesting part, and this is the second part of my research I want to bring out, is that all these non-contributory new programs require ID documents. Okay, I didn't appreciate the importance of these documents until I really started studying social policy on the ground. Until the mid-1990s, almost a third of children were not getting birth certificates. If you don't have a birth certificate in Brazil, you're not going to get to first base in life because you cannot get all the subsequent documents. You can never get a carteira assinada, a formal work card. You cannot get an identity card. You can't buy anything on credit. Poor people have to buy on credit. You cannot even legally die if you don't have a birth certificate, in which case your family can't get funeral assistance, and you can't even be buried in some cemeteries. So this is really necessary. Hardly anyone does research on this issue, but I think the push towards documentation, because it's a requirement for these new social programs, is going to end up being one of the most lasting legacies of this new period, whether we want to call it incorporation or not. So the question is, what explains these new programs? You know, is this a punctuation? Is it a result of more gradual developments? Again, I think it's economic context, post-adjustment, economic recovery. There's also a big technocratic element, top-down, bureaucratic expertise, international ideas, even the documents thing. You know, UNICEF is really trying to get kids all over the world documented. But also very much a democratization aspect. I wouldn't say these programs are the result of bottom-up pressure. I would say they are top-down. They do not create mobilization, and they are certainly not the result of mobilization. But politicians are looking for votes. Lula benefited greatly from his expansion of the Bolsa. José Serra, who ran on the PSDB ticket, expanded the Programa Saúde Familia greatly in his last term as Minister of Health, conveniently right before the election. That's another very important new social program that has benefited the informal poor sector in Brazil. Now, Brazil is not alone in this. Many of these developments are being seen in the region, but I think Brazil might be an extreme case of inequality, high technocratic expertise, and a lot of this vote jockeying around these programs. And what's interesting is it's also a case where clientelism had been the way in which social provisioning was done, with federal transfers going to states, the governors giving the money to their friends in the municipality, and then this kind of vote trading circus. This really changes all of that. So I think that's very, very important. So stepping back, because I want to embed my research into a broader background, the first set of categories is really the idea behind the Vargas incorporation with the CLT. It was corporatist, so occupational status was the main criteria of your inclusion. It really was confined to the formal sector, white-collar and blue-collar formal sector workers. That mapped onto a pretty strict urban-rural divide. Most formal sector workers were in urban areas. In fact, most people think that Vargas widened the gap between the coast and the interior with this manner of social policy provisioning. Benefits were also seen as a privilege. Okay, you guys are all lucky you can be in the CLT, and we have the right to exert authoritarian control as a result of according you these privileges. So don't organize horizontally, don't keep your head low and your mouth shut, basically. That is not at all the discourse or the reality of the current set of programs. And then to the extent there was social policy provisioning outside of the formal sector, the way this tended to be done was federal transfers out to the regions, and then these transfers became grist for political machines. I would also say that ID documents were provided to a privileged few. The carteira assinada, the work card, was the be-all and end-all. Vargas recognized that modern countries documented their people. First of all, they knew who was a person in their territory, and then they documented them. So there was a brief period after 1937 where he tried to get birth certificate provisioning, but it was quite fleeting. Okay, so that's the broader embedded quality. The current regime, so I would say really honestly from Cardozo onward, okay? Making use of the 1980 Constitution, but really from Cardozo onward. It's broader inclusion. It's the povo, the people, instead of workers. The unit is individuals and families. There's been a major extension to the informal sector, especially, I would say, these people tend to be in rural areas. The whole discourse, and I would say the reality, is that benefits are an entitlement, okay? The idea that you're privileged and because you're privileged you should be quiet is gone, okay? It's gone in the rhetoric, it's gone in the reality, it's gone in the design of programs. Bureaucratic provisioning, eligibility, means testing is very prominent now, and that's a very different means or mechanism or criteria than patronage. And along with this new social policy regime or citizenship regime, people have to have an identity. Now, this is partly for social inclusion. You need these to get these programs. But one part of the anti-clientelism is to weed out the undeserving. So it's exclusion of the undeserving. And that's the flip side of making sure everyone has a document when they apply. Okay, so that's the background. Now, I did research with Natasha Borges Sugiyama that asked about the Bolsa Familia. Okay, and this research is finally written and it is forthcoming in the next edition of Comparative Politics. And it's entitled something like Whither Clientelism, Contributions of the Bolsa Familia in Brazil. And we thought, okay, we've studied, we've gone to Brasilia, we know how the ministry has designed this program, we know it's really hard to get through kind of, it's insulated politically. We know they stress the rights. How do poor people actually see this, okay? Do they understand it this way? Because when you think about it, you have to go to the local Bolsa Familia office, which is sometimes in small towns in the mayor's office. So why wouldn't you think, here you are, you're illiterate, your whole life you've traded favors for votes. Do you really understand what this program is about? And our assumption was, our point of departure was, that if it is truly citizenship building, poor people have to understand it as a right. They have to, first of all, understand vaguely how it works. They can't see it as stigmatizing. They can't see it as patronage-based. But we thought there were scenarios in which people might not understand the program. So to get a handle on how they thought about it, we asked them. And so we went to 3 locations, 2 in the state of Pernambuco, and 1 in a rural location in the interior of Bahia. So the idea was, okay, this is clientelist patronage heaven, okay? There have been some major deals made between the oligarchy and the poor up here. So this is a hard test of whether people really see this as clean and citizenship building and inclusionary, etc. So we did a 1,000-person plus survey in these locations, and then we contracted focus groups run by people with PhDs who knew the issues we wanted to get at, but also were from the Northeast, so really knew how to talk to people with very low levels of education. And it's this research that will be coming out in this comparative politics piece. So to summarize here, we thought, okay, there are 2 ways of thinking about this. Does the Bolsa fall more into a kind of citizenship building, social inclusion, empowerment type scenario, or, is it more of the same? So we asked people in the surveys and focus groups, I'm not going to go through it because we're one-by-one questions. We tried to first get a sense of whether people understood how the program worked, because it's not altogether straightforward. Your payment depends partly on how many people are living in your house, whether there's a retirement income, how poor you actually are. So we thought, okay, if something is going to actually empower you, you have to be able to understand it. So some of the questions get at what understanding is. Most people do understand the basic principles, okay? The women were better at it than the men, partly because they are more involved in the program. But they might not have been able to do the math, but they knew that if your family composition changed, your payment would change. They understood the conditionalities, etc. We also then tried to ask about whether they saw it as stigmatizing or not, or whether they saw this as more, you know, the government is finally paying attention to me, and the results could not be clearer. There's very little sense of stigma associated with the Bolsa. We asked various questions, but we got really to the point in one of the questions. We said, are you ashamed, or are you proud, or are you neither to be a Bolsa Familia recipient? 90-something% were either proud, or they said, tenho nem orgulho, nem vergonha. I don't have either one. And then we had a kind of an open-ended part to try to get people to talk about social inclusion. And many people said, you know what, until now, the government hasn't cared about us at all. We had no belief that democracy would ever bring about anything. You know, finally, we have some recognition. So I think despite the means testing, despite the conditionality, okay, because many, especially academics, are anti-conditionality. They say if it's your right, how can it be subject to conditions? We didn't see this when we talked to people. They understood it as objectively based. Okay, we said, do you think you will lose this if you don't vote for the right person? Is this subject to vote trading? People said, oh, I have, yeah, you can sell your vote for other programs. Okay, lots of people acknowledge that. Yes, I have sold my vote. This is the going rate for this. But most people said this doesn't work that way. The mayor can't just pull out a Bolsa grant for you. So they understood it as not falling into the patronage scheme. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't do patronage on other programs, but they don't see the Bolsa as being like that. One thing people really appreciated about it was that it's reliable. It's a small amount of money, but it's reliable. You don't have to subjugate yourself. The idea that it provides autonomy, not only from the local political class, but from your husband, came out loud and clear. We also asked people a series of questions to try to get at this political brokerage issue. Like if your payment didn't come, if you had a problem with the amount, how would you go about resolving this? So the patronage answer would be, I would call my town council person. The bureaucratic idea would be, I would go to one of the social workers hired by the federal government, or I would call the 1-800 number. All over this Bolsa Familia literature, they give you the 1-800 number. You can go to any payphone in Brazil and pick it up and call. There's like 10 operators, and they're sitting right there in front of the computer figuring out what went wrong with your payment. So I said to my co-author at a certain point, Natasha, this is too good to be true. No one's going to believe this. But honestly, people said they would call, and they had called. So the whole idea of mediation seems to be diminished. So I would say it's very rights-based. We have a question in the survey. Do you see this as, and in the focus groups, a right, an entitlement, or a favor? So it's obrigação ou favor do governo, making sure that people could distinguish between a right and the favor. The lion's share of people said this is obrigação. It is an obligation of the government. So the punchline here is that this is a big, important advance that goes well beyond what the actual money is and the poverty alleviation. I think the step away from clientelism and toward citizenship building is really important. So that's one kind of whole area that I'm trying to embed in this conception of a new citizenship regime. And then the second area I want to talk to you a little bit about is the whole revolution in documents provision. Okay, and again, this goes well beyond the actual material benefits you get from any of these contributory programs or from the health programs. One needs documents anyway to function in a modern country. And what these non-contributory programs have done is really increase the incentive to get them. There are many obstacles in the way of getting them historically. Money, distance, just total lack of understanding, needing to show paternity, such that in the mid-1990s, Cardozo was aghast when he found out that a third of all kids in the country did not have birth certificates. Not to mention poor elders who could not even pick up a non-contributory pension because they didn't have any identity. So I think this is a very important part of this new idea as well. So point of departure is documents are absolutely key for modern citizenship. And there has been an incredible demand, increased demand for documents, beginning with the birth certificate, but then working your way through the higher level ones. After the programs of the Bolsa Familia and the non-contributory pension came through. So we know this through a bunch of econometric type studies that suddenly see older children trying to get birth certificates. Usually if you haven't gotten one within the first 90 days after birth, you probably won't get one. But after the Bolsa, and social workers could tell you anecdotally, one of the big problems in the beginning was you couldn't actually apply for it because you didn't have a birth certificate for yourself or your kid. The parents have to have birth certificates too. So sudden increase in demand, okay, with these programs. Tons of social worker accounts saying, I cannot sign people up for this because they don't have the wherewithal. Lots of adults going out and getting birth certificates, 70-year-olds trying to retrace where they were born. And in our survey, we ask, did you have to get any documents in order to apply for the Bolsa Familia? Huge number of people said yes. So the demand clearly went up with these new non-contributory pensions programs. So we also see, however, the state start increasing the supply through various initiatives. First of all, some interesting public ad campaigns. Here's literature. You can find these in lots of little town halls and clinics in the northeast of Brazil. So I have a name and a last name. I'm from the Brazilian family. So this is Ronaldo. I bet most of you didn't know what his last name was. So the name and last name is a UN. It's a UNICEF campaign. Every child has the right to a name and a last name. This would be one of them. So registro de nascimento, birth certificate, it's a right that gives right. So this is nation building. I mean, look at this. This is not lost on anyone, right? That this looks like the Brazilian flag. It's nation building through a state-led effort from above to try to sort of incorporate the poorest of the poor. So a big campaign. However, also, alternative channels to procure documents. Historically, these cartórios, or public registries, have been necessary to provide documentation, but historically they've also charged a lot. They are very few and far between in some rural states. And it's been very difficult for poor people to navigate getting them. In some states, getting a birth certificate was equivalent to something like 20% of one monthly minimum wage. So when people didn't see need and there were obstacles, the result was many people did not get them for themselves and their kids, and this really excluded them from modernity, basically. We've also seen, starting with Cardozo, but very much expanded under Lula, a campaign, federal campaign, to reduce costs for getting documentation, starting with the birth certificate, taking away any penalty for late registration, but also the state subsidizing the registries, the cartórios, in order to make sure that they actually do this for poor people. The other legal change we have seen that's been very important is you no longer need your father's name on a birth certificate, and that has reduced the stigma for a lot of people to getting one. So the result is a dramatic decline in the number of children, also late-age adults, doing this in order to get social programming. And again, the punchline is you're better off with one of these anyway, but historically there wasn't an immediate incentive to get one. So I would say this is a further step toward citizenship that I think is very, very important. Now, to get the non-contributory pension, they even push you to get a formal sector work card. Usually, people who are that poor to get a non-contributory pension are not going to find themselves in the formal sector anytime soon. But the aspiration is to go higher. And now even maids, as of last week, domestic servants, can get some of the provisions of being a formal sector worker. So this is really changing. I think we are seeing Brazil at a very different stage from the last time I was in this room. So I think this is a very positive moment for citizenship. At the end, I'm going to spend 2 minutes and show you a little video clip of this birth certificate campaign propaganda. Lest we think this is all rosy and all change, let's go back to reality for a second. There has been change, but there's also been some serious continuity. Okay, so the idea of a living museum where you can get changes, but some of the old stuff doesn't entirely go away, really does hold true. Okay, this is not, there's nothing bottom up about this. This is still Brazil. It is top-down incorporation. Something like the Movimento Sanitaristas that pushed for universal preventative health care. They are societal pressure, but what did they do? They entered the state. Okay, those people are all technocrats now. So, and politicians are jockeying for the votes of the poor. You saw it with Lula through the Bolsa Familia. You saw it with José Serra, massively extending the Programa Saúde Familia. But I would call this top-down, with a very, very large technocratic element. But politicians are more accountable now. They're more accountable because more people vote. It's a more mobilized society. And it's a society where, let us not forget, the landless movement, the Movimento Sem Terra, looked fairly formidable at points in the 1990s. So meeting kind of the needs of the rural underclass, may in fact have been quite a demobilizing move. In fact, there's some evidence that the Movimento Sem Terra demobilized in areas where the Bolsa penetrated the most. So think of that for a while. I would also say that although there's been an extension to the poor, the broad patterns of spending and who receives the lion's share of the money in Brazilian social welfare state is still absolutely the more affluent. So basic universalism has not replaced the privileges of the formal sector. I would say this is added on to the old regime. Pensions still, formal sector pensions still make up a huge share of the social welfare budget. And the federal universities still, in the eyes of many, take too much money at the cost of primary schools. So it is still the old Brazil in these ways, but with, I think, a very, very important extension of the welfare state. I would also say the elite accommodations that have been made to even get these programs and to keep them do limit the reach. Okay, this is not massive redistribution. This is an elite accommodation, not unlike some of the things that happened under the first Vargas regime. So is this a new moment of incorporation or not? One thing you would have to ask is incorporation into what? You know, while Lula is beyond good and evil, he's a god to the informal sector poor, especially the rural Northeast. Our line of questioning and the vote pattern, so we saw it in our survey, you also see it in votes. People are fans of Lula. The same people are not pechistas, though. They are not strong affiliates of the PT. Even if you look at the vote share, Lula's vote share in the Northeast went like this after he used federal resources to appeal to the poor. The PT in the Congress is much, much flatter, okay? So while many people receive these programs and they award the PT in presidential elections, they're not, this is not party incorporation, okay? They are not lifelong affiliates of the party. So the question is, okay, what is needed to engage this sector politically? If they are incorporated, is this sort of just a broader kind of state incorporation? In any event, we can go back and forth of whether this is, even deserves to be thought of as a parallel or not to the Estado Novo. But in any event, I think some very important steps forward have been taken in Brazil towards making poor people fuller citizens. So now I'm going to show you, just to give you a flavor for this, two of these documents.
Don't close it.
Oh, so thank you. Advertisements.
Just click on the
It's
play
like
at the
sitting
bottom
there
left.
wanting to be a bulldog. Okay, why is it? Oh, wait, I hit that, and then I say, I want
The
this.
play at the bottom left.
Oh, okay. Here?
Yeah.
Eu sou meio Stephanie de Souza, sou Anauê Papachó, sou Ronaldo Nazário de Lima, sou Inácio do Carmo, sou Josefa Pereira, sou Tapini Baroni, eu sou da lei, eu sou Samuel, sou Juvencio, sou da família.
Ajude a família Brasil a crescer. Para fazer a certidão de nascimento, vá ao cartório mais próximo ou se informe na prefeitura sobre os mutirões. A certidão é grátis.
Pai, você deve tirar a certidão de nascimento do seu filho. Tem que ter nome, sobrenome e participar dos programas sociais.
Uma certidão de nascimento, eu tenho acesso a todos os documentos.
A certidão de nascimento é cidadania. Basta você tirar RG, CPF e carteira de trabalho. Certidão de nascimento é um direito que dá direito. É um dever de todo o Brasil.
Governo Federal, Brasil, país de todos.
So evidently they do the wave in Brazil too. So here I am, and I want to now see the next one. So how do I
Hit
advance?
escape,
Oh, okay, here I go.
and then click on the next
We're
tab.
going to go to that. Then we're going to go to play.
Eu tenho nome e quem não tem, sem documentos eu não sou ninguém. Eu sou Maria, eu sou João, com certidão de nascimento. Sou cidadão. Tirar a certidão é de graça e garante benefícios para o seu filho, como escola, vacinação. É só o pai ou a mãe comparecerem ao cartório mais próximo com algum documento de identidade em mãos, seja na sua cidade ou no município vizinho. Com certidão de nascimento. Sou cidadão. Uma campanha Rede Globo em parceria com o Unicef.
So in parceria con UNICEF, so UNICEF is on a mission around the world with the birth certificate, and Brazil is actually held up as one of the cases of how to do better and make up for a lot of lost time quickly. So it's a good thing João rhymes with cidadão, or else that baby would fall apart. Obviously, you can get more out of these if you know Portuguese, but they kind of walk you through why you should get one, how you should get one, so on and so forth. So I'm very interested in people's comments. I am hoping I didn't try to do too much, but I wanted to do the specific within the general.
Should we start by thanking you?
Oh.
Why don't we collect maybe 2 or 3
Okay.
questions at a time?
Okay.
So, Ben, do you want to start?
Yeah, I was wondering if you, in just a details of the Bolsa Familia, if you have to apply with the municipality, how do you have any sort of guarantee that your application will go through without any exchange of favors to Brasilia to get your benefits?
Okay, so what is your guarantee that it actually goes through?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then in the front.
Oh,
Yeah.
I had a question about your comment about those who were trying to get documents, couldn't get documents because they didn't have any. How was that catch-22 resolved? And then secondly, my concern about the people who live in the favelas, have those become targets of social change in terms of building better housing or improving the health status of those sewer systems and so forth and things like that? I'm concerned about the public health of people living in the favelas.
One more from our church.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. It was really good. I guess my question around the idea of citizenship. Maybe, I mean, from my perspective, I have some problems in identifying Bolsa Familia as a citizenship right, in the sense that a left progressive force, and it's to think about it in the sense that if you think about it, the coverage is wide, right? But the benefits are very little. I mean, if you earn above one quarter of the minimum wage, you get like $7 per child, right? So thinking now $7 per child as something that is a citizenship right, for me it's kind of problematic. So Bolsa Familia takes very good care of those at the very bottom, right? Those below a quarter of the minimum wage. But between those guys in the bottom and what we call the privileged workers, here very much in, I don't know, a privileged worker in the MSS sector, there are millions of Brazilians between the two, right? And the thing is, what do you do with all those Brazilians who earn either nothing or $7, and the MSS workers who are a minority? Right?
When did you want
Okay. What is your guarantee that it goes through? I think the one vulnerability I see is that the people inputting the data are hired by the municipality and they are not concursado in many cases, so they don't have job stability. That is changing. They're trying to make those people sort of professional Bolsa Familia inputters paid by the federal government with their whole livelihood dependent on the federal government, not the locals. You can check to see if it went through, but there's no guarantee that there is not some manipulation at that end, but you could easily run a check on it. And what I didn't tell you was one of the checks is a societal council, and these are actually operative in many municipalities, that kind of look at the program, and the municipality will get in more money if there's no reports of hanky-panky. So it's a convenio, basically. Now get this also, another check that the right people get in and that the wrong people get out. The Bolsa Familia rolls are public. So if you're in a small town and you see the mayor's wife on the Bolsa Familia listing, you know there's a problem. There's less and less fraud because there's been calling to the ministry saying these people can't possibly be poor enough to get it. And so there's a societal kind of watchdog check as well going on. On the documents, catch-22, how are you going to, here you are 70 and you need a birth certificate, how are you going to prove this? They've relied actually a lot on the Catholic Church because most people have some idea of being baptized or not. And so the church has stepped in and provided a lot of this. Much of this is accelerated citizenship building. There are these campaigns that are going out to rural Brazil. One of them is run by the Land Reform Agency. So different agencies of the federal government run them. They go out in boats, in air-conditioned buses, with computer programs all linked up to Brasilia. So you start in the front of the bus applying for a birth certificate, and you end at the end, applying for an age-old pension. So this is telescope citizenship, if I ever saw one. I think they probably have to look the other way on some of these facts in order to provide birth certificates for older kids. But they do use the Catholic Church a lot. Favelas. Anybody who lives in a favela in Rio and Sao Paulo is probably making too much money to get the Bolsa Familia. The Bolsa Familia pennant is mainly for the north and northeast, and it's mainly for people in rural areas. I asked about Rio. They said most in Rio make way too much money, even in the favelas, to get the Bolsa. So this really does go to the poorest of the poor. The 1/4 of a minimum wage is to get the non-contributory pension. You can be wealthier than that and get the Bolsa, depending on your family composition. See, for us, the amount of money seems really small, but there have been a lot of assessments on the Bolsa. The nutrition levels in families getting the Bolsa has risen considerably on this small amount of money. More kids are in school, especially teenage kids, because the labor of teenage boys especially can bring in enough so that you've got to basically pay people a higher amount to keep those teenage boys out of the labor market in school. So they have figured this out over time and increased the age of the children. And the differential is seen most for older children who could be making more in the labor market. So the wages have been adjusted accordingly. So yes, it seems like a small amount of money, but if you look at some of the ethnographic accounts beyond, the really tight econometric things, it has reduced poverty. It's low-hanging fruit. You're that poor, you inject $50 a month into the household, it has an effect. So now on the citizenship building thing, this is complicated because you need to stay poor to keep getting the benefit. So how does that, really build you up? You also have to have children in the house, okay? Now, no rational person ever had children to get the Bolsa Familia, and they calibrate it such that until recently there was no extra incentive for any more than 3 children. And that's partly a PR thing. They don't want criticism of the program. So my question would be not, how can this small amount of money build citizenship? It would be, okay, to truly build people up, they need to be enhancing their human capital. The mothers of these kids need to be getting vocational training. There needs to be an exit strategy. The long term is in play here. I do think this is an important point of traction for very, very poor people, and you need to start somewhere. But it certainly isn't the end of the story.
I do. I am curious, because I think it's fabulous research and very, very interesting. I'm curious though, do you have any idea as to whether or not, because this has been in place for a while now, if the electorate is expanding? Voting is compulsory in Brazil. You can't vote if you're undocumented. So there should be some political motives for incorporating that segment of the population which is excluded because they don't exist. So I'm just wondering if, in fact, the voting population has expanded since the midnight. It started as the Bolsa Escola originally in the federal district.
Right.
So
Now,
I'm just curious about that aspect.
I mean, you're smart to point to this because my question was, it's shocking to me that some seeking politician didn't figure this out beforehand, right? You document people, they vote for you, we're both happy. In India, in fact, that's what's happening. Different politicians from different parties are getting people registered to vote, and guess what? In the meantime, vote for me. Illiterates didn't vote. There were large sections that, in a de facto way, just didn't vote. And, the documents thing, okay, while it sounds easy, It depends on a certain level of bureaucratic efficiency and autonomy and, frankly, technology. Technology is a large part of this. And so I think some of the permissive conditions were not quite there, along with the barring of illiterates. I think that took a lot of these people out.
Next one was Brian.
Great presentation. I think in particular the gathering some insights into citizen perceptions of CCPs is a really important contribution.
Thank you.
But I have a couple questions on the elite side.
Okay.
One, I mean, it's clear that the design of the program makes it so that mayors or local elites can't use it. Do you have any sense if they've tried and then gave up because it was so hard? Or are they just satisfied because there's enough other stuff they can give people that they don't have to use it?
Well, do you know that they went and camped out at the Ministry of Social Development when the design of the program was announced, and it looked like it would bypass them? And for some very poor municipalities, the amount of money coming in through the Bolsa is something like 14, I've seen figures as large as 14% of the entire amount of discretionary funds they have. So for them not to have this, they were not happy about. So they were not happy about it, and they made their discontent known, and the ministry and Lula said basically too bad. Now, they basically are barking up easier trees. I mean, my claim is not that the old troca de favores doesn't happen. It still does, and people even admitted it to us that they do it over other things. This particular program, though, doesn't have it, and I mean, ideally, right, there will be, over time, the development of a norm that you shouldn't have to trade your vote to get social provisioning from the state. So that's the hope, that there will be a generalizing sort of spin-off effects.
So there's another program of similar scale in Brazil that actually targets sort of more lower middle class, which is the Minha Casa Minha Vida housing program. And it struck me looking at your list of attributes, you know, that actually apply very comfortably to this program too. Like
oh, really?
Sort of bypassing the municipal government and means testing and things like that. So, I'm wondering how this analysis you think would apply to other types of social programs.
So, do you know what income segment in terms of deciles that is?
Like between 0 and 3, 3 to 5, and like 6 to 10. So there's 3 targets. Or
Okay.
three groups.
Yeah, there's no reason, I think, why this can't be more broadly targeted, right? This is what the critics of extreme focalization, you know, a la Chile, now are accepting as a okay accommodation, balancing out economic rationale. You know, you're not going to give universal programming in a poor country. And there are a lot of people who don't need it. So, you know, I don't know that program specifically, but I'm glad to hear you say that you think it can function within these broader attributes. That would basically mean that you had, you know, it wasn't just the poorest of the poor, but people who need to be brought in, who are getting what they need under a new regime. I just have not followed that program that much.
It was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Okay.
And it reminded me of this story I heard on NPR that I think was about the expansion of identity documents in India, which you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Which sort of, to me, raises the question of, you know, you mentioned the second incorporation wave that's sort of starting to sweep Brazil. And, you know, how do you see this sort of incorporation spreading across Latin America? And sort of how do you see it spreading across the developing world?
The world. You know, the Indian program of ID documentation is really interesting because talk about technology being important. It's through a retinal scan that they are going to document 1 billion Indians. because evidently no two people have the same retinal composition. And this is a way that a country without much state capacity, nothing compared to Brazil, is going to be able to do this. So I think that's an interesting program. To run effectively a program as complex as the Bolsa Familia with this federal-local coordination, which has really been the vulnerability before, you know, not having the locals run away with well-intended federal money. You need a certain state capacity, I think. And I gave something like this at Brown and Varjny, Atul Varjny, is that it? Yes, said, that sounds nice. There is no way India could begin to run a program like this. You know, first of all, 70% of all Indians live in rural areas, and 30% live in urban areas. It's almost the mirror image of Brazil, with you know, 30% still in rural areas. And you do need a pretty effective state. So when I kind of criticized Getúlio for saying he was the father of the poor, but the poor were only 20% of the population, part of it is just a state capacity issue. And so I think that will be a limitation. For instance, Bolivia has a program. So these CCTs are spreading throughout Latin America. Bolivia has a program, and both a non-contributory pension and a Bolsa-type program, they're universal, partly because so many Bolivians are poor and the Bolivian state is so weak. It's basically decided, okay, we can't target who is poorer than anyone else, just give it to everybody. And my understanding is it hasn't worked well at all. Less kids go to school now than they did before Bolivia's version of the Bolsa. And part of it is just an ineffective state problem.
Did you have your hand up before, John?
Yes.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. It was really good. I was just wondering, there are differences in the criteria used by the BPS and the Bolsa Familia.
Absolutely.
And very different grants. The BPS is much higher than the Bolsa Familia.
One salario mínimo.
Yes, compared to Bolsa Familia, which is about 1/5 or this. And do you think it's a problem, and how to handle this problem?
You know, the non-contributory pension provides a lot more money than the Bolsa does. And the Bolsa gets cut off once your children are all exited from the house. You can get a very, very bare minimum, but basically it's for families, not single people. One of the reasons they can provide, however, the one minimum wage for the non-contributory pension is it only goes to 3.5 million people, whereas 50 million families are in on the, 50 million people are in on the Bolsa. So yeah, I recognize they're very different. So when you said you have to make a quarter of minimum wage for the Bolsa, that's not true. You can make more, but you also get less. So I think they're extremely different. In terms of keeping people out of absolute misery, though, I think the BPC is a more important program. The Bolsa, though, is aimed at the next generation. The Bolsa is aimed at breaking the intergenerational transmission of poverty. The mother is a vehicle, okay? I think the missing link in terms of looking at the future is the mother needs to be capacitada. There has to be some secondary program to get these mothers, you know, trained for the workforce, even at a minimum level, because they will be completely vulnerable when they stop getting the funding. I think they are very different programs with different audiences in mind. They're politically quite different, too.
Any other questions? Yeah. I just had a comment. As like Brazilian citizen and Brazilian parents, but having grown up here, my mom told me like that she didn't have a birth certificate, but like since I grew up here, it just seems so crazy to me that like she didn't, and so it was really interesting just to learn more about like why that was.
Why did she not have one? Do you know?
I think just like she like pretty rural province or like city, I guess, and then I think she's like, I don't know. I think they just never really got one specific.
But she never tried to really work at a high level in Brazil, right?
Well, they immigrated to the U.S.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I think she wouldn't have gotten very far in Brazil with that one, because it's the stepping stone to everything else, and it's a society where you need, you know, half a dozen documents to get anywhere.
Yeah, it's kind of just crazy to me that, like, I don't know, just coming from like a U.S. perspective, it just seems so odd to me, and that like she didn't even know exactly like when she was born. So it's interesting to hear about why that was.
You know, I went out on one of these registration campaigns in Pernambuco. I was blown away at, I was absolutely blown away at how little people knew about themselves. Some people didn't know how old they were. The other thing you really saw was a lot of these people were illiterate. If you can't write your name, you have to use the thumb stamp, and that is the big stigmatization in Brazil. But no, they're really on a mission. Now, this is the biggest no-brainer I've ever heard, but do you know, historically, there hasn't been provision to get a birth certificate in hospitals where lots of babies are born. Can you believe that? So the big new invention is Lula paid the registries to set up shop and basically not let anyone leave without one of these. But you know, talk about historical institutionalism. I think one of the biggest signs of the past, kind of legacies of the past, is the weight of these registries. They are passed down generation after generation. Some of them have been held by the same family for 200 years. So my co-author and I looked into some of them. In huge municipalities, like there's a whole area of the state of Pará, Altamira, there are 4 registries in that state. How is a poor person going to spend a good section of his or her minimum wage, travel hundreds of miles to one of these, to get a birth certificate whose, you know, purpose was not even clear until recently? Well, word has it that Dona Huerchi Cardozo sat down with Fernando Henrique Cardozo and José Serra and said, this situation is abominable. Brazil, I'm not going to live in a country that has this level of undocumentation. Now do something about it. And they were evidently unaware of the magnitude of the problem as well. Now, this is not just Brazil. The whole South America is seeing birth certificates going up and provisioning going up. And it is clearly in response to social programming towards children. They may not be doing it as effectively and dramatically as in Brazil, but this is something that's happening in the region as well as the world. The cases that are particularly low on documentation are ones with a lot of indigenous people. Okay, rural and indigenous are the big strikes against documentation.
So I think we've run out of time. Is that correct? Yeah. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.